Thank you, Nathan. Well, I'd like to extend a sincere thanks to the organisers for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. So already this morning, I think we've heard very diverse talks, very interesting diverse talks, from kind of communal hunting to folklore to large-scale disruptions, and we'll go to an even more complex phenomenon now, that is the brain of the average undergraduate. So we're going to zoom in after a long time zooming out, and so what I want to talk about is decision making, but what kind of social norms and social mechanisms we may employ when we make seemingly simple but often quite complicated social choices amongst each other. So my field broadly is what we might call decision neuroscience. So we're interested in understanding how people make choices and decisions. Traditionally, various disciplines have studied this, so three in particular. So psychology has spent a lot of time trying to understand how people make choices and decisions from what we might call a descriptive perspective, that is trying to simply describe what happens when people make a choice. So not making any value judgments about how good the choice is, but simply the descriptive role. And people like Danny Kahneman and Amos Tversky have done kind of a laudable work here, trying to explain how often we deviate from what might be seen as an optimal decision. Economics has often been interested, of course, in choice. Sometimes slightly different type of choices, often aggregate choice and at an optimal level. So whereas psychology is notionally being descriptive, economics has been prescriptive. So this is what we should do in order to make a good decision and a good choice. And there's many beautifully elegant mathematical models within economics kind of describing what an optimal choice is in a given scenario. But economics has the disadvantage often that these beautiful models often don't match our descriptive reality. So the models are beautiful, our behaviour is somewhat less so. And so there's often a gulf there that has proved difficult for these folks to bridge. And for the past 150 years, beavering along has been neuroscience, also again seeking to understand choices, and now being able to directly measure from the living and deciding brain. Usually, of course, animals, certain unfortunate people undergoing surgery have consented to allow electrodes in their head as they make decisions. But up until maybe 20 years ago, most of the work within neuroscience was really looking at animals. So which way does a rat run in a maze? Which button does a monkey press to get a juice reward? And so there we can, of course, get very detailed measurements of individual neuronal firing. But the choices that were being described were kind of quite fundamental, often very basic perceptual decisions. So in the past 15 years, there's been a real concerted effort to kind of merge these disciplines as much as possible and try and take the strengths from each and be able to basically build better models of decision making. And so when I say better, these are models of decision making that are psychologically plausible, so that capture something about the way we actually behave. They use a formal modeling approach. So unlike many psychology models, which are quite post hoc, that is, we observe a behavior and we say, oh, must have been the mechanism underlying this, can we use the kind of economic approach and formally model the decisions so we can do some useful prediction? We'd also like to take into account neurobiology on the grounds that this is where the decision is happening, so we should be at least informed by what's possible in the brain as decisions are being made. And also, can we broaden out decision making from typically the types of decisions studied, particularly in psychology and neuroscience, often quite limited, what we might call individual decisions. So decisions made usually about things like risk. So which option should you pick? If option A is the risky one with the high reward but the high punishment, and option B is the safe one. There's hundreds, if not thousands, of studies trying to assess our risk preferences. But of course, we make decisions in a much richer environment in everyday life, so we'd like to broaden it out. So this is our slightly idealistic goals of this field, and what I want to talk about is a couple of, or at least one recent experiment that we've done that tries to take this approach to understand a particular process. So social motivations, as I mentioned, are, I think, relatively understudied within this field of decision making. This is I live in the Netherlands now, although I'm not Dutch. I live in the Netherlands, and if you've never been to the Netherlands, this is almost a perfect representation of the Netherlands. It's completely flat. It's kind of moderately sunny, and she has a modest ice cream cone. And this summarizes, I think, the modest, practical Dutch, which may be influenced by their landscape. But so the other thing about this picture, which you may be able to tell, right, you're all socially attuned individuals is that she's not looking that happy. Now, why wouldn't she look that happy, right? This is as good as life gets in the Netherlands. She has an ice cream cone and the sun is out. She's standing in a field. When I show you the rest of the picture, of course, it immediately becomes obvious why she's not so happy, right? So what we have here is a classic case of social comparison. Her ice cream cone all of a sudden doesn't seem so good now that it's paired with this traffic cone of goodness by her friend here. And this is a commonly observed phenomenon. And even when if we scan this woman's brain, we even see activity in her valuation system changes as a function of this guy's arrival. So when she sees this, the actual neuronal value of this ice cream gets less. So these, seemingly perhaps high-level processes like social comparison are often encoded at a very basic level in the brain. And so that's where we've been interested in for the past many years, trying to understand these social motivations, understanding how they may be kind of mechanistically implemented in the brain and what consequence that may have for understanding behavior. So the basic question, how do social motivations influence decision making? And in particular, what mechanisms, both psychological as well as neuronal, are used when deciding in social context. And we study many social contexts. The one I want to talk about today is trust and reciprocity, actually specifically reciprocity. So when we're put in a situation where there's a kind of a norm of reciprocity, how is this implemented in the brain? And can we use the brain to give us a little additional insight into the psychological reasons for reciprocating a favor? So we use a commonly known game called the trust game. Many of you may have heard of that, some may have not. But it's we steal all our tasks from experimental economics. They have some really nice, elegant tasks which are very simple to implement. They work well in a scanning MRI environment, and people get quite engaged. So they're very nice tasks. So one task is the trust game. So in the trust game, you're our participant. You're paired with a stranger who is a real person, but you don't know this person in advance, namely Peter. We tell you the rules of the game are as follows. I, as the experimenter, I'm going to give Peter $10. My brain is still in euro. $10 as an endowment. And Peter has a decision that he can transfer some of this money to you if he wants, but he doesn't have to. And the rules are whatever Peter does decide to transfer is going to be multiplied by a number, namely in this case 4. So whatever Peter decides to give you, I'm going to multiply by 4 and you get the resultant transfer, right? So if he decides to give you 8, you will then receive $32. Now you know this in advance and also Peter knows this in advance, okay? So this is open information. So the more money Peter transfers to you, the bigger the pot gets basically. And then the second part of the game is that you then have an opportunity to return money to Peter. But importantly, you don't have to. And again, Peter knows this in advance, you know this in advance. So the basic question we ask of our participants, and we'll be looking at today, is how much of this $32 do you want to return to Peter? Right? Knowing that you can say 0. You can just walk out the door with the money and there's nothing Peter can do about it. Okay? So this is in essence the trust game. The two parts. The one part, does Peter trust you? Of course, if he completely trusts you, he should give you all the money. It'll be the maximum pot, and then presumably you'll return some and everybody's better off. If he doesn't trust you at all, he should give you nothing. Because, of course, there's no responsibility, it's not necessary for you to return anything. You can keep whatever Peter gives. So the question is then, how much do people return? And people return all different amounts of money. So for example, a common amount is 16. So people take, that seems reasonable to give Peter half of this money, which I wouldn't have if not for him. So often people give Peter back 16. Sometimes they give 15. Because then he has 15 plus his 2 is 17, where you have the remainder 17, so that seems fair. And people use all kinds of reasons to justify all kinds of transfers. But one thing they seldom do is give nothing, even though they can. And even though, again, Peter can't do anything about it. Of course, that's the economically optimal thing here, is just to keep all of the money. But this doesn't tend to happen. And to some degree, this is an economic puzzle. It's not really a puzzle if you're in this situation. It's quite hard just to take the money and walk out and say bye to Peter. That takes a certain type of person. But indeed, of course, these traditional economic models predict that you'll return nothing. So whatever you get, you're just going to keep, because it's a one-shot game. There's no reason, either strategic or any other, for you to return money. But on average, people return about 50%. There's a lot of variation there, but on average so. So people are clearly returning money when they don't have to. So one question of interest for psychology and neuroscience is why this is the case. So why return money if you don't have to? And there are several theories out there floating around. One is the notion of an equity aversion. That is, people really dislike unequal outcomes. And so one reason I give Peter back money is to kind of equalize the end amount, right? If I give him back 15 or 16, we both have more or less the same amount of money, and I kind of feel at ease with myself and with the world. Another theory we've been working on more recently is the notion of guilt aversion. That is, as an Irish Catholic, I feel very qualified to study this, but this is the notion that the reason I give money back to Peter is because I'll feel bad if I don't, right? So this is a motivation more focused on kind of the state of the world and the state of a principle of equity. This is more focused on I'll feel bad if I let Peter down, right? So I know Peter has expectations, and of course we know what Peter expects. Peter usually expects back about half. We know this because we ask him, and you know that. And so one reason you might give then is to kind of not feel bad about yourself. And we have some brain evidence for this. This is from an older study. This is when people actually return money back to Peter. We see activation in this area called the insula. And the insula is heavily involved in things like negative emotions and also assessing expectations of others. And you know, this is distinct from, say, a warm glow account where I give money back to Peter because I feel really good about helping Peter. People never really feel good about helping Peter. They kind of do it because they feel they should. So this at least gives some suggestion that at least some people may be giving because they're trying to match the expectations of Peter, trying not to feel bad about potentially letting him down. So, you know, we have two potential strategies. Now, that usually what would happen here is that we kind of pit them against each other. We find out which wins, and that becomes the strategy for understanding reciprocity. But, you know, we find this a little bit perhaps simplistic, that the idea that a single strategy should account for kind of all reciprocity behavior. We know that in the real world, you know, people have different kind of moral principles and moral beliefs. Some people, you know, value kind of public safety. Some people value kind of private ownership more highly. So we see this all the time, and we've no problem understanding that in the world this happens. We see it on questionnaire data too. This is from Jonathan Haidt, showing that as political identity goes from liberal to conservative, different kind of norms come into play. So when you're strongly liberal, things like authority and purity are less important than when you're strongly conservative, but things like harm and fairness are more important. So, you know, people have, there's a multiplicity of these moral principles or beliefs in the world. So it seems reasonable to think they might also exist when trying to make decisions about whether to return a favor or not. So the basic notion is that there may be multiple motivations at play in decisions to reciprocate. The problem with using a game like the trust game is that often these motivations predict the same outcome. So for example, if I'm inequity averse, if I think the principle of fairness is really important, I'll tend to give Peter back about 50%. Conversely, if I feel that Peter's expectations are really important, I don't want to let the guy down, I'll probably give him back about 50%. So just looking at behavior doesn't help us understand which particular motivations may be relevant in making these decisions. So in a standard trust game, as I just said, an equity aversion predicts we'll return about 50%, but so does guilt aversion. So just looking at the behavioral data doesn't help. So we decided we'd do a combination of looking at slightly different behavioral data, but also down at the brain, and see perhaps that these motivations separate out neurally, even though the behavior may look the same. So to do this, we had a slightly altered version of the trust game called the Hidden-Multiplier trust game. This is what I've just shown you. This is a standard trust game. The important things to remember from this is that we multiply whatever Peter sends by 4, and Peter believes this multiplication factor is 4, okay? Because it is. So everything's honest now. True believer economists should cover your eyes now, because this is the bit where we slightly deceive our subject. We don't deceive our, well, we do deceive our subjects. Technically we don't, but we'll get into that debate again. So we tell our subjects that on a certain number of trials we're going to do something different. On a certain number of trials, this multiplier now is actually going to be times 6. But importantly, we're not going to tell Peter. So Peter's going to still make the same transfer. He's going to still believe that you have $32, but you actually have $48. Okay, so here's where those two predictions then diverge. So if you believe what's most important is Peter's wishes, you know that Peter's expecting back about $16, about half of what he thinks you have. So you should give him back $16 and be, quite happy to pocket the change and not feel bad about it, okay? So if the kind of principle of keeping Peter happy is important, you should give him $16. If the principle is that, you should be, there's a principle of fairness here, that whatever you have, you should share with him, you should give him back half of this approximately, right? 24. So now those two behavioral observations diverge, and we can start to make assumptions about which motivations are at play based on how much people give in this scenario. Just not to make it too easy for our subjects, so we also tell them, and on some trials, we're going to do this. Okay, we're going to have a multiplier of times 2, but again, Peter believes it's times 4. So now if you believe the principle of keeping Peter happy, not letting Peter down, matching Peter's expectations is important, you should actually give him now all your money. So remember, in this case, being matching expectations is actually somewhat profitable because you keep the remainder. However, in this case, it's entirely unprofitable. You end up giving all your money back to Peter and not even getting the feeling of that you're the kind of a martyrship. You don't even get that because Peter never knows. But similarly, in this case, the times 6 multiplier when giving half was important for the fairness principle. So here you would cost yourself money. Here, of course, you would give back 8 of the 16. You should just give back half of what you have. So that's how we kind of set this up. We have people simply play these games, many one-shot games. 50% of the time, it's the standard times 4. But 25% of the time, we tell the participant the multiplier is now going to be times 2 on this trial. Peter sends money, what do you do back? And 25% of the times we do it times 6. And importantly, you know about the multipliers, but Peter doesn't. So what do people do? Well, firstly, just some little pictures of brain activity. This is kind of sanity checks for us. So what I'm showing you here is the additional activity in the brain when you're in this times 6 and times 2 multiplier conditions, right? So these are the conditions where something different is happening. And then we can compare that condition with the condition where it's a standard times 4. And we get extra activity here. This is the front of the brain, this is the back of the brain. So we get extra activity here in the front part here on the side. And this we know is brain area heavily involved in something like working memory, strategic planning, and so on. So at least these people's brains seem to be aware that something's different now. Okay, I have privileged information that Peter doesn't have, and their brains reflect that. The second sanity check we like to do is make sure that our brains are responding to how much money we get, and they are. So this is we find activity in this part of the brain and this part of the brain, and these are basically the brain's reward systems, and they scale with the amount of money Peter actually gives me. So again, people's brains are paying attention to how much money they get. So at least people are plausibly conscious and alert for this, which is important for these kind of studies. Okay, so what might we predict from this? Well, we might predict that if people are inequity averse, so if people are sensitive to the kind of basic norm of fairness, of equality, we should see a pattern of behavior like this. That is, they should return money as a function of how much Peter's given them, of course, but that this should separate out as a function of the multiplier, because of course the bigger the multiplier, the more money they have. When it's a times 6 multiplier, they have the most money, so they should be willing to give more back. So if we see this kind of fan pattern, it will give us evidence that people are inequity averse. Conversely, this is actually all 3 lines overlaying. If people are guilt averse, if they're really just giving Peter back what he expects, we should not see any differentiation, right? They should just always do the same thing because Peter always believes it's the same thing. When we look at the real data, of course, life is never so clean. So we get this somewhat of a mush in that this is the actual experimental data averaged across all participants. So we see this fan pattern, but it's not nearly as prominent as we might expect by inequity aversion. So our conclusion from this is that we do have some kind of a mix of strategies at play here. So we can dive into the individual data and see, do we have evidence for this notion that neither guilt nor inequity aversion is sufficient on average, to explain reciprocity. And I've cherry-picked some subjects here, but to give you a flavor of how people behave. So these are individual participant data. So, there's always people like this. So this is someone who just never gives back anything. Or gives back very much. There's always a few. It doesn't matter what you do, there's always a few. So these people, we might say are motivated by greed, right? They want to keep as much money as possible. It's a perfectly reasonable thing to do in the game. We always get, 5% of people just keep the money. We also get people like this this is similar to we might call an equity follower, in that they make pretty clean distinctions between these three symbols, denote the three multipliers. That is, they seem to be responding to fairness. We have people like this who are very similar, irrespective of the multiplier, and these are people we might say are kind of guilt or expectation followers, right, as we saw. And then we've these people. These people turn out to be really interesting. Right? These are what we've called moral opportunists, in that they do obey a social rule. They just obey the most convenient social rule at any one time. So, for example, when the multiplier is times 6, and they have 48 euro, they think, well, I think it's reasonable to match Peter's expectations, right? That's all that's really, Peter's really important here, so I'm going to give him back 16, and if I happen to profit from this, well, that's just the way it goes. But then when the times 2 multipliers come along, and now they have 16, they think, well, I think fairness is a valuable principle in life and society, and I should abide by this, and thereby I'll give Peter back 8, because that seems like a fair thing to do. So, we never have anyone who switches the other way and gives the least optimal amount. So, I think they're interesting that they're not these guys, right? They're returning money, they're reciprocating, but they're using different kind of strategies depending on what's optimal, which I think, if we all stare into our souls, maybe what many of us do in everyday life, right? We pick a moral strategy, but we pick the one that's going to benefit us best. So, how do we get into the brain? I'm going to gloss over this because in the interest of time, but we try and formally model this, and we have this utility model to quantify this. We have 2 parameters which are relevant here. There's this parameter and this parameter here, so theta and phi. Theta basically gives us do I care about social preferences or do I care about financial gains, right? So we have our guilt followers, right, who have one value, and most other people have something else. And then we have this parameter, which gives us a sense of, are we driven more by guilt or more by inequity? And so this is going to be a complex slide. It's all right, don't panic. The important things are that we have here, these are the 2 parameters here. Each dot here represents a subject, and we can do a lot of simulation, so we can segment these areas into these, hopefully you can see these 4 colored segments here. It's actually 5 colored segments. No, 4. 4 colored segments here, which represent each of these type of people, right? Represent our greed followers, right? Represent our moral opportunists here. These represent our people who are following a kind of fairness principle, and people here who are following this kind of principle of avoiding guilt and matching expectations. So we can at least start to quantify each of these people behaviorally, which is fine, so that we can look at how these people may differ on behavioral traits and so on. But what we can also do with this is feed this into our brain data. So while people are doing this, they're lying in an MRI scanner, and we're imaging their brain every 2 seconds, the whole time they're making these decisions. And we can use these values to try and understand what different parts of the brain may be relevant for each of these different motivations. Oh, sorry, one thing I should say, we've also replicated this now 3 times with 3 different populations, 3 different samples, and slightly different changes to the games. And we see a quite stable distribution of strategies. Most people tend to be moral opportunists. We have quite a few inequity averse, and then less greedy and less pure guilt averse. So moral opportunist is a common strategy across multiple replications. But when we look at the brain, so we can look at the brain representations of these motives. Now we can make life hard for ourselves here, but by only looking at the ×4 condition. So we're only going to look at situations where the behavior is the same. Obviously, if behavior is different, the brain is going to be different. But we're only going to look at conditions here where the behavior of all of these groups, except for the greed group, is actually the same. They give back the same amount of money, but we're going to look at our different parts of the brain being used to generate this monetary amount. We do some analysis. That's where I wave my hands a little bit at the moment, but we do analyses, and we also were interested in these moral opportunities. So anyway, to cut to the chase, so there are several brain regions where people with similar decision strategies seem to cluster together. And these are many of the brain regions we find. Happily for us, these are all regions which are usually found in decision-making studies. So we're not finding anything too extraordinary here, which is a good thing. So we find areas like the insula I showed before. This is an area involved in these kind of negative affective responses often. We see the putamen involved in the reward center, and also this medial prefrontal cortex and dorsomedial prefrontal cortex. These are involved in heavily involved in valuation. So there were no big surprises here, which is good. One more slide. But what we do find is that different decision strategies seem to be computed in different brain regions, right? So this is interesting for us because now we see that, for example, this is an area called the medial prefrontal cortex. And I'll just focus you on the ×4 condition here. So this is inequity aversion, kind of heavily recruits the medial prefrontal cortex, but greed and guilt aversion do not. So this indicates, and also we find it ×2 and ×4, indicates that this particular brain region seems to be doing computations specific to this inequity aversion. And we see other areas here which are interesting for various reasons. But a different set of areas seem to be involved in this guilt aversion computation. Okay, so we have identical behavioral outputs. People are giving back Peter 16, but different constellations of brain regions are being used to generate these responses, indicating that these motivations are at least different neurally, and they have different and meaningful brain patterns. I have a PhD student who's entirely too fond of complicated graphs, so I didn't have time to shout at him about this one. But what this is basically showing is that we can also look at these moral opportunists, right? These are people who switch, their behavior switches. So one question we asked, is there a brain system of moral opportunism, or are they simply recruiting the two different strategies depending on what's optimal? And it seems to be the latter case. That they shift between these guilt-averse and inequity-averse brain representations as a function of what's monetarily optimal. All right, so I will conclude. So what I hope to show is that, you know, there's not so much this crowd, but to many crowds, the importance of social motivations and these mechanisms and trying to understand decision making. We're heavily influenced by the social context we're placed in. We very rarely make decisions purely based on no social information, so we need to understand it better. When we're looking at responses and decisions about prosocial behavior, in this case, they are computationally and neurally quantifiable. So we can start to think, I think, in a more principled way about these mechanisms that underlie prosocial behavior. And different motivations to reciprocate are evident across different participants, right? So we wonder, is this some kind of a moral phenotype? So we've started work now where we're looking at, are these kind of motivations, do they generalize to other types of tasks, other types of scenarios? So if you're a guilt-averse person in this case, are you a guilt-averse person in many other decision scenarios? So we don't know. And I'll end with an Irish playwright quote. So, you know, as opposed to the golden rule, which you're supposed to do unto others as you would have them do unto you, Shaw says, do not do unto others as you would want them to do unto you. Their tastes may not be the same. And I think the evidence here shows that people have different moral principles, and inflicting our own ones on other people may be not necessarily a source of harmony. So with that, I want to thank the people who actually do all this work, and thank you all very much for your attention.
For questions.
So I just wanted to ask a couple questions about the experiment. So do they think they're playing somebody different each time?
Yes, they are playing someone different each time.
And how did you arrange them to give you such a nice array of offers? I mean, so your graphs have offers from 1 to the total, and normally they'd be concentrated.
Yeah, we selectively choose certain ranges of offers. So we do a pre-test where we generate a bunch of offers from people, and we pick a range that's going to... we pick a assortment that matches the range.
So they aren't real people in the sense that...
They're real people, but we're selective. You know what I mean?
So you're giving the receivers not the actual distribution of offers that you got in the pre-test.
That's correct, yeah.
Just a quick question
Sure.
about guilt aversion. How do you establish that Peter wants 16 back and not something else?
So that's a good question. I guess two parts to that. Your latter part is we ask Peter. So in all of these experiments, we ask Peter kind of what do you expect back? What do you think you'll get back? And we incentivize him to be accurate. Most of the time, the Peters of this world expect back around half. Some people have ridiculous expectations, but most people are fairly keyed into that half the case. The second point I'll make is about guilt aversion, because I now wish we hadn't used the term guilt aversion, because I think there's many other aspects of guilt here. So what we're really looking at here is the expectation. So matching Peter's expectation.
I mean, when I talk about guilt aversion,
Okay,
I
good.
mean in the
All right.
economics definition
Yes.
of guilt
Yeah.
aversion.
So
But
we
still,
ask
I mean,
Peter.
like
Let's
what I'm trying to say, that the trust game allows for any possible beliefs there. So
Yeah.
it's totally unclear theoretically, or
It's theoretical and clear, but people do tend to cluster. So it tends to be the case that whatever Peter knows you have, he expects back about half of that. Now that doesn't hold for the end points. So if Peter gives you back one, if Peter gives you one, he usually doesn't expect much back, and he usually doesn't get much back. If he gives you 10, often he expects back a little bit more. So at the end points, those beliefs change a bit, but in the mid-range, Peter's expectation, at least as we've assessed, is that it's about half.
so you just use some data from
Yeah.
belief solicitation to
We do. We also
measure
ask.
how
We also
this-
ask our participants, "What do you think Peter expects back?"
Right.
And that matches again more or less Peter's expectation.
Okay, thanks.